This was a fortunate stop because we found some food. Some of us found some beans under the thresher, and some found some carrots in a bin somewhere, and some found frozen sugar beets. And the ones that ate the sugar beets ended up with terrific diarrhea, which is a factor in the next part of the story. The sun came out when we were there, and it was a nice warm winter day, and the boys sat down, took off their shoes and so on, and there were black feet and black toes and frozen ears that were dripping fluid, and just a mess. After a couple of days, the Germans decided we're going to walk again, and the boys said, no, we're not going anywhere. And so they yelled and they threatened to shoot and so on, but they said, okay, shoot us. And they decided not to. We reminded them that the war was nearly over and there were going to be war crime trials. So they said, well, we'll get you some transportation. So they marched to a little railway station there, and there were some boxcars. So we got on these boxcars, the famous boxcars, 10 Chevaux, 20 Amis, and but we were standing shoulder to shoulder. We were on those boxcars for 3 days without ever getting off, for any reason, and got maybe a little water once in a while to drink. And so you can imagine sugar beet diarrhea and standing in the boxcars for 3 days. So we were then transported up to a place called Luckenwald, which is about 25 miles south of Berlin, about 25 miles from west of Magdeburg, about 10 miles west of Potsdam. And this was a big concentration camp where they had a lot of slave laborers and political prisoners. And I guess there were about 30,000 prisoners there. And a big graveyard nearby, and it said there were 10,000 graves there. This was just a horrible place, and very crowded. We had hardly any space. The bunks were just side by side. And we were infested with lice, and the place was full of fleas. We got hardly anything to eat, and we were all sick. I had a terrible hacking cough that I didn't know what it was all about, but I found out later that it was developing tuberculosis. So anyway, we were there from the middle of February, and then the Russian front started to come again, closer, and by the middle of April, we could hear the Russians coming, the guns and the aircraft and so on. And the Germans decided they were going to take us down further west and south, because they still wanted to hold us as bargaining chips. And as a matter of fact, they tried to round some of us up, and everybody was very reluctant. We weren't going to get out on the road again, and we weren't going to get on boxcars. And they took a group to the station, and then they couldn't get a locomotive to pull the train, so they brought them back. And, the SS had a fort down about a mile or so from the camp, and they came to the camp and demanded that we go and dig trenches for them. But our senior people reminded them that the Geneva Convention wouldn't allow us to do that, and they said, well, if we see any problem with you helping the Russians, you're all dead men. And So we could hear the Russians coming closer and closer. And then one night the RAF came over and bombed Potsdam, and it just rocked the country. It was 10 miles away, but it just, you can't imagine the concussion from those big bombs. We were in our bunk one night listening sort of what was going on, and an aircraft came over and strafed the building, and we could hear like rain on the roof. And fortunately, none of the bullets hit us. They were shooting at something beyond, and this was the shells that came down, and we all thought we were dead. The first Russian we saw came in a Jeep. He came through the camp and told them just to stay there, that the troops would be in, and in a few hours the tanks came crashing through the fence, and there were these Mongolian people, men and women, riding on the tanks with these quilted winter suits on and their machine guns. And they were very jovial, gave us a great welcome, and out they went away again. And we thought we were free. However, in a couple of days the administrators came through and they said, oh no, it's not safe for you to be out in the country. You get back inside the walls. So they rounded us all up, put fences up again, and we were prisoners again. Now, we knew that the Americans were over at the Elephant River, which is about 65 miles away. And we knew that they had met with the Russians. And there was no reason why we couldn't go home. However, there was no way. They said we all had to be registered, and we would not be allowed to go west home. We'd have to go back through Russia and to Odessa and come home that way, which was made us very unhappy. However, one day the Americans showed up with a big convoy of trucks to take us out. Everybody, a bunch of guys climbed on the trucks, and then a Russian patrol came with their guns off. And they gave the Americans 5 minutes to leave the compound. And so we realized we were hostages. And my buddy and I, a chap from out west, Goheen was his name, we said, we're not going to stay here. No matter what happens, we're going to leave. So that night, he and I went out under the fence, and we thought we could see where this American convoy was. And so we made our way through this bush, and we found the American convoy. And we talked to the sergeant and persuaded him to take us back with him when he went. But he said, you know, you don't have any papers and so on, and you can't go through the checkpoints. But we said, well, you take us back as far as we can anyway. So away we went in the morning, and on the way, Russian patrol stopped us and said, follow us. But they were intoxicated and very disorderly. So the sergeant says, oh, I can get away from these fellows. And he did a U-turn and away. And he said, no, I think I can get you across the river. Because we can't go through the checkpoints, you don't have papers. So we went to, he took us to a railway bridge that had been blown up in the water at Magdeburg, and there was enough superstructure above the water that you could crawl through and pull your way across to the west side of the river. It's a very wide river there. And then we got over and we were in the American occupation zone. We got some instructions from some civilians there and found a camp, an army camp, and they treated us like long-lost brothers. It just was wonderful. And the cook came out and he said, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't know you boys were coming. He said, I haven't got a meal ready for you. You'll have to just have some of these army rations. And he put out a meal that we just thought was just better than any Christmas dinner. But it's surprising, we couldn't eat very much. And the bread, the white bread, looked like cake. Very, it was quite a psychological experience. So we went through the various processes. We were there for a few days, and then we were taken to Hildesheim, and then we were flown to Brussels. And in Brussels, we were deloused, and we were issued proper clothing and so on. And we were in Brussels for a few days, and then we flew to Ford Airport in England. There, we were taken to Bournemouth, and I was informed that I had been commissioned while I was away, and I was given an allowance to go to London and get an officer's uniform. Was in England for a short time, and then came back on the Louis Pasteur back to Canada. It was much different than the trip over when I was in other ranks. We had we ate at a table, and we had napkins. People brought us our food and so on. It was kind of nice. We docked at Halifax and by train, and at every little station, people were meeting us with cookies and candies and all sorts of stuff. And at Campbellton especially, they had a whole pile of goodies for us. I got back to, we came back from Lachine, and from Lachine we were given a holiday, a furlough, and I spent some time at home. From there I was in Toronto at the old Eglinton Hunt Club for a few days, then to Camp Borden, and I was chosen to be an administrative officer to partake in the demobilization of the boys coming back. So I was given a course there for a few weeks, and then I was out to Calgary for 2 months at the No. 7 Release Center, where I was in charge of a bunch of clerks. And what I didn't know about administration, you wouldn't believe. So I talked to an old sergeant there, and I said, now listen, Sarge, you know, I don't know anything about this job, and you know everything, so if you don't give me any trouble, boy, I'll back you up all the way. So we had a great arrangement, and I got through that. I learned how to drink wine with the Roman Catholic priest, because he and I were about the only officers on the camp that weren't medical officers. And it was there I heard the medical officers, when you get a bunch of doctors together, they talk medicine. I thought, gee, that sounds interesting. I think I could do that, because these guys, they don't look that bright, so. And so after a few weeks there, the massive demobilization came through, and I was discharged, and the war was really over. And nobody wanted to hear about it. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't feel good about anything I had done, and it was so I just got on with my life. I decided, boy, I'm here. There's some reason why I'm not dead, and I better make some use of my life from here on in. And so I went at it and got an education, and here I am. Now, the first person I talked to about it was Todd. And about 3 years ago, I got a call from the Alumni Association in Toronto. Am I all right, Jeff?
Yeah, you're okay.
And he said, they said there's a man in Wales looking for you. And he thinks you were with his father when he was killed. And he'd like to get in touch with you, but we can't give you your address. but this is where he is. So anyway, I wrote him a letter, and with my phone number, and I got a phone very soon, and it was a Mr. John Clark, who was a surgeon in Wales, and my flight engineer was his father. And this lad was 4 months old when his father was killed. And his mother never ever would talk about it. And he didn't know anything about his father. And he was very upset and very obsessed with knowing everything he could about his father. So, as a matter of fact, in a very short time he was over in Barrie and spent 3 days, and we talked about this story then. And a very nice man and his wife, and he's about 65, I guess. Then about 2 years ago, I got a letter, and it started off, "My name is Thomas Baller, and I come from Dusseldorf, Germany." And he said, "I am a member of a local historical group, and I have a title of Protector of National Memorials and Monuments." And he said, "I have found an aircraft engine which came from your plane, and I would like to see you. I'd like to talk to you. First of all, I'd like to know what you think of Germans in Germany, and see if we can get together." So I wrote back and told him yes. I had dropped bombs in Castrop Rauxel, and I had landed this in a little place, and would you like to hear my story? And in about, when I got a computer, my wife had said, "You know, these stories you told Todd, you've got to write them down, because, you know, you're an old man and people will want to know this story when you're not here to tell it." So I sat down and wrote about 35, 40 pages of the story, and I sent it to him. And he had done a lot of work on it, and another historian that was there. And so I shared this with John Clark, and we all got together, and Thomas Baller, he said, "You'll have to come over to Germany, because we're making a project of this with our historical society, and he would like to see you." So I was very dubious about it, but anyway, Todd says, "You gotta go." So we went over, and they took me to this little village, Trills, which is about 10 miles, 8 miles east of Dusseldorf. And there were a bunch of people on the street. Oh, maybe how many, 30? Yeah. And I said, "What are they all standing in the street for?" And they were standing in the street to meet us. And they just gave us the most wonderful reception. The mayor of the town was there, and the town council. And so they welcomed me, and they took me around and showed me where my various crewmen were found by the villagers. And they took me to this little building, and immediately I see the bush and the church and the house, and it was the house that I landed on. And during the ceremonies, the man said, "I'd like to give you a present," and it was like a picture. Yeah, and he said, "Unwrap it," and I unwrapped it, and in this was a framed piece of white cloth. He says, "This is a piece of your parachute." And somebody had made a handkerchief out of it, and it was an exhibit out of their local museum. And so we went to see the motor, and this had been found on a farm in a pond. There had been an earthquake, and the pond had drained, and there sat this big motor. And the landowner, he thought it was just great, and he took and put it on a plinth, and his wife thought, what are you keeping that ugly thing for? I don't want that on. Anyway, he said, well, that's part of our history, and we're going to keep it. And so their name was Guldenberg, and Mrs. Guldenberg gave us the best, just the most elaborate banquet that you could imagine, and we all sat around the table and talked, and then they took us up to Kleve, where the Reichswald Forest Cemetery is, where Allied, most of the Air Force were buried. And it's just acres, just row and row and row and row, and you go down age 18, 25, 23, just all young men. And so this is where my crewmates were buried. Then we went to Britain, and John took us back to the old airport, and went back to where I was billeted in a big country manor, and we were given a wonderful, they opened it specially for us, and gave us a tour of the building. And then we went out to the airport where we flew from, and the British newspapers were there, and they made a story about it. And I got to sit in one of the new training planes on the airfield by the chief instructor. So there was still a lot more to find out about this story, and a lot of people had more information. So they all gathered at our place in September of 2007. And we had some other crew relatives had heard about it. And a chap came from Alberta, one came from Ottawa, and so we went down to Trenton, and they sat around our living room, and they talked for about 3 days, I guess. And the German folks stayed with us for 2 weeks, and we had just had a great time. They were great friends. Then, about a few months ago, the Historical Society sent me this book. It's in German, but if you want to pass it around, maybe you could have a look at it. There's a very nice inscription in it in the front of it that this Thomas Ballard had written. And so we still keep in touch, and recently, well, maybe 6 months ago, I got a letter from a fellow by the name of Werner Baumeister. And he's a German judge, and he said, I've read the story, I've talked to Thomas Ballard, and he told me your story. He said, I was a 16-year-old boy on the anti-aircraft guns in Castrop-Rauxel on November the 21st. I saw an aircraft get combed in the searchlights, and he said, I heard 4 explosions that night, and there were 4 aircraft had been shot down that night. And so there was the man who was writing to me that had been shooting at me during the war. And I haven't met him, but some of the other folks are meeting in Germany now, or this Christmas. And there were a lot of witnesses turned up. And this chap that handed me the handkerchief in the frame, he said, I was 6 years old. He said, I saw you come down and land, because it was fairly early evening. And my dad said that was a soldier that came down from the sky. And he said, for all the rest of my childhood, I was afraid this soldier was going to come back and get me. I was afraid, so at one time I was a boogeyman. And he said, now you're here and you don't look that scary. So, the sad part is, these 5 young men, just as brighter than I was, would have had wonderful lives if it hadn't been for that terrible war. And when I came back, I was so blessed. I had so many opportunities to make something of myself. And one of the people who really gave me the biggest opportunities were my high school teachers. They tutored me and they just bent over backwards. And so I've always been a great fan of school teachers. I think they do the most important work. And so through my life I've had wonderful opportunities. I've met so many great people, and these poor fellows never had a chance. I think Todd maybe have a word or two.
Grandfather said, unfortunately I had something prepared and it was it's stuck on my computer with the power outage in the trees, but I've heard that story quite a few times. I've been lucky enough to hear it quite a few times. So the first time, Grandpa said, was about 20 years ago in the middle of the lake in Quebec, and being a naive teenager, I decided to ask, you know, what did you do during the war? There's not a big filter between your brain and your mouth when you're that young. You don't really think of the effect that the war had on anybody. So it would have been easy for him to say, I don't want to talk about it, or to kind of sugarcoat or gloss over it and say, oh, I flew airplanes. But he told me the whole story, and the story you heard tonight, and some stuff you didn't hear. There's a lot to the story that would take a lot more time than we have this evening. But it's incredible, and every time I think about it, I just think I'm so fortunate to be here. That I even exist is a real miracle, and it's just a constant source of inspiration for me. So you know, if I get down, or if I'm thinking, you know, something's tough, it's good for me to reflect back on the story and just realize like there's a lot more adversity than I've faced, and I'm so lucky to be here. So and very fortunate that I got to go to Germany with my grandpa and see all these places. It's incredible. And you hear the story, but to go there and see the buildings are still there, and to see the forest that he ran into, the motor from the plane, and all these people, it's just an incredible experience. And I guess one of the most profound things was that cemetery in Cleve, and like you said, it's just thousands and thousands of graves as far as you can see, and it's pretty humbling to stand there and see all that. So it's just a great experience, and I'm really grateful that I've gotten to be a part of it. It's very lucky.